Assalamu alaikum. My name is Fadwa Wazwaz, and I'm doing today's presentation. This will also be another clip from the next section of the lessons on Joseph and Jacob, love and rejection. We all claim to be enlightened. All of us like to present ourselves as individuals of enlightenment. And there's enlightenment in the sense that it comes from God, because God is the source of light. And I mentioned that in my book, God intervenes between a person and their heart. And there is, as I mentioned in another video, light upon nations, fire, which comes from Satan. And then there's also the lower commanding nafs or ego. When it overpowers its own self, it seeks to enslave another. And I mentioned that in more than one blog, that an individual who's enslaved to their ego seeks to enslave another. Let me say that again. An individual who's enslaved to their ego, outside, you will notice that manifestation is they seek to dominate others, manipulate others, overpower others. These are all signs and manifestations, not of their victory or their light, but they are manifestations and signs of their being slaves to their egos. So I mentioned the situation where Zuleika and Joseph get to the door, and then she took it from the door to, she couldn't prove her innocence. So therefore she went out and started to hype the crowd. And this is, again, if you study the Quran, you'll notice this pattern, how the Quran tells you what to expect from criminal minds. If they cannot deny and project, initially, remember, she denied and projected. This is not a woman issue. We saw the same thing with the brothers of Joseph. Remember, they started with denying and then projecting. By projecting, meaning here not on Joseph, but more so on Jacob. You know, that they're telling the truth, so they're making him feel guilty, but you don't believe us. You know, you don't trust us. You know, that kind of language, even though the agreement that they made with Jacob, upon in peace, they violated their own promise and their own agreement. So you could see how the lower self argues and debates. You could see how Satan argues and debates. I am better than you. Now, some individuals, they tell you, they write articles about how the ego is, and they'll say like, I'm unworthy, I'm unlovable, I'm this, I'm that. That's not how the ego speaks. God tells us very clearly in the Quran how the ego speaks. An archetype of the ego is the Pharaoh. He says, I am your Lord Most High. That's how the ego speaks. Because it's enslaved to its desires, it obsesses with dominating others. When you cannot discipline and control yourself, you seek to control others. It's going to be a light video, short video, because I will go further than, and the upcoming video this weekend will be on, again, where we move from the section where he was thrown in the well. Now he's going to be thrown in prison. So I'll mention that in the coming video. But here, if you look at it, I want to take you to this verse, given the situation that is happening in Gaza right now. Now, I like this verse a lot. It comforts me when I get really bothered and upset at issues. And it's like you say in your mind, well, like the evidence is as straight as day, it's clear as day right there in front of them. All these specialists confirm the evidence. It's not like you're hyping a crowd or something. I'm referring to here. Court of International Justice. Like, you're not calling them to follow Sharia law. I could understand, like, if they are resisting because they're like, well, we're Jews. We don't follow Sharia law. We don't follow Quran. We follow the Torah. Well, it's like, we're not asking you to follow Sharia law here. We're asking you to follow the Court of International Justice. International Court of Justice, my apologies. July 30, 2024. UN member states must immediately comply with the recent landmark ruling by the International Court of Justice on Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory. A group of, here, I want you to focus on, 38 UN independent human rights experts said. These not Muslims said, this is not your buddy, your friend, your institute of buddies where you go out for coffee and you enjoy each other. Went to the International Court of Justice. Evidence was presented. A group of 38 UN independent human rights experts said that UN member states must immediately comply with the recent landmark ruling. And so as you could see, today is July 31. And so what do? They go ahead and they kill the negotiator of Hamas. And this is their way of, because they did the same thing, like when the ICJ said that they're plausible genocide, they went after UNRWA when they came up with the rape ruling recently. And, you know, this ruling right here, they went and they killed the negotiator. So every time it's kind of like, excuse my language, they give you the middle finger and then they go ahead and kill and assassinate someone. It's kind of like, again, this kind of in your face, like, try and stop me. You know, have you ever met a bully? Every time you present information, you present reason, you present evidence, and their response is to huff and puff and show you, bang, you know, I can pop you and bring you to the ground and you can't stop me. And so therefore they're like, we won the argument. This is literally, if you've been following along, how they have been reasoning. But people are not aware that today is July 31. July 30, 2024, UN member states were told they must immediately comply with the recent landmark ruling by the International Court of Justice on Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territories. And a group of 38 UN independent human rights experts said, we're calling them to law, order, rule of law. This is a law that's agreed upon by these UN member states. So just to give a little context to this discussion, although here it's mentioning faith, but you could, the spirit of the verse is kind of the same. Are those people who are not following the right path in spite of admonition, like instruction? You can give them instruction, bring evidence, bring witnesses, bring journalists, videotape it, you know. Are they waiting for God to come to them in canopies of clouds, serenity of angels, and settle the matter finally? To Allah shall all matters ultimately be referred. So these words, like, again, it's if you can think of the psychology here, is what I'm trying to get at, of the people who you present evidence upon evidence, evidence upon evidence, and a rule of law that they are bound by. For the most part, they wrote. I don't think like Muslims, and I haven't verified in depth, were heavily involved in the writing of the international laws. I could be wrong, but I think most of this was heavily written by Western states and European states, you know, European, Western, US, Canada. So they had a very, very large impact in international law, in the writing of international law, the laws, the rulings. They have a very, very large impact in this law. So, but it gives you that psychology of how a criminal thinks is what I'm trying to get at here. Doesn't matter if they sign to a law. It's kind of like, remember when I mentioned Joseph's brothers, they made a law, they agreed, they said they were bound by that. And then they tried to start playing that skirting kind of musical chairs around the agreement, the law, the promises that they made. These words, again, are indicative of an important fact. Man's test lies in showing whether he accepts reality, even though he can't perceive it directly through his senses. And whether after having accepted it, he has required the moral stamina to obey God, even though he's endowed with the capacity to disobey him. So what criminals think, you know, is because they can get away, they can disobey, God is on my side. And that's what I'm trying to get at here. And what this verse is saying is that just because God is not coming down with canopies of clouds and angels to settle the matter and stop them, doesn't mean that God is on their side. Prophets were sent in revealing the scriptures, indeed, even in performing miracles. God is always taking care to leave scope for testing man's power of judgment and his moral stamina. So they're being tested, said it over and over again. It's not you're not superior. You're actually being tested. Because if one listens, I've been following like the discourse, just mainly listening. And there was a lot of questioning of God's will, questioning God's decree, questioning why God allows certain things to happen. And over time, I came to the realization that when people do that, God gives them power, and then he tests them to see how they will act and respond with that power. So God has always taken care to leave scope for testing man's power of judgment and his moral stamina. He has never disclosed reality to such a degree that man would inevitably be compelled to accept it. Like the idea, the fact that there is no powerful force right now that's able to stop what Israel is doing doesn't mean that God is on your side. He just left this space as a test, you know. And of course, when it says here, disclose reality, I mentioned that already in other videos, it's that the beautification of sin is you reject the evidence. You agree on what is an international body of law. You agree on the rules. You agree on the international laws. You agree on the member states. All of that you agree on. And then when a group of people say, this is how we see the evidence, it's not one or two, you still reject it. You still reject it. So it is pointed out therefore that people should not keep waiting for God and the angels, the devoted servants of his realm, to appear before them. Because that's like, you know, that's how like Pharaoh thinks, that's how criminals think. Well, you know, why doesn't God stop me? Bring on the punishment if we're the wrong people. Well, look, you know, Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated, so therefore God is on our side. That's how some people think. But if that were to happen, it would mark the end of everything. There would be no occasion left for man to decide anything. No room for growth, no room for reflection, no room for understanding, no room to benefit ourselves. We'd just be kind of like robots. To believe and to bow in submission, surrender, obedience to God are of value only so long as reality is presented in such a way as to make its rejection possible. This is what is presented. This is what I mean by the test. I wrote this many times, in many blogs. The test is that God gives you the space to accept, but he also gives you the space to reject. And many people fail the test because they feel they have the ability to reject, that they can then do whatever they want and no one can stop me. And they don't just like say, I reject because I'm not convinced of the evidence, you know, they reject and they continually do criminal acts that are against, again, here we're just putting aside Sharia law, we're saying, that are against agreed upon international laws, UN rulings. They're not just rejecting like God, they're rejecting anything, any agreement, any covenant between them and others. Because when you reject the truth, you start off by rejecting it, internally, as I said, you're like a slave to your ego, and then you start outwardly rejecting everything, every agreement, every ruling that you ever made, every covenant. And you're not just rejecting the covenant between you and God. If truth were to be fully disclosed, and if man were to see with their own eyes God on his throne of majesty with the entire universe acting according to his command, what would be the worth of their faith and obedience? So they're being tested. Yeah, no one's compelling you doesn't mean God is on your side. The fact that you have the space to reject and disobey doesn't mean God is on your side. It means God is exposing you. He's exposing your internal reality, what's in your mind, what's in your heart, because no one's psychoanalyzing. If you notice, no one really has to psychoanalyze Israelis. Israelis are doing it for us. They're justifying rape, justifying assassination, famine, war crimes, they're going on and on and on, justifying everything that's against international law that they agreed to be bound to. So if all things were physically observable, not even the most stubborn unbelievers and the worst sinners would dare either to disbelieve or disobey. So right now, like for example, the situation was such that every time Israelis did something wrong, they were like smacked down with a thunderbolt, smacked down with a thunderbolt, smacked down with a thunderbolt. They don't really have time to think about what they're doing or to make a choice. They're just being compelled to make a decision without the space to say, I want to disobey. It's kind of like what they're doing, by the way, to like people in Gaza. Like anytime someone reads the wrong way, they're like, they throw a bomb, 500-pound bomb, 250-pound bomb, 2,000-pound bomb, 4,000-pound bomb. So just running around bombing, assassinating, and thinking, if you read the right way, we're going to bomb you. If you do this, we're going to torture you. We're just going to keep doing whatever we want to do and force you to be dominated, manipulated, subjugated to our will. You can't promote coexistence if this is, your nature. But again, God is exposing them because their hearts are so closed and they're assuming that they can reject, they can disobey, no one can stop us. They're interpreting it in a very perverse manner, thinking that therefore they have victory. Acceptance of faith, because what does faith mean? Again, is the right judgment. And obedience has value only as long as there remains a veil over reality. And I mentioned that in the beautification of sin. I mentioned the veil, the blindfold. The moment when reality is totally unveiled would mark the end of the period granted to man to decide and of the testing period for him. It's kind of like Ariel Sharon, huffed and puffed in Sabra and Shatila, and in Lebanon, that he's called the butcher of Beirut. Huffed and puffed, and how many people, they assassinated and killed. And they killed also, at that time, it wasn't Hamas and Netanyahu. It was, if you recall the conversations, it was Yasser Arafat and Ariel Sharon. And they poisoned Yasser Arafat. They assassinated him, just like they assassinated Ismail Haniyeh. And so where is Ariel Sharon? You know, he didn't die as a like killed at the hands of the Palestinian. I didn't think that God wanted him to die that way. He died actually in a coma. And it was akin to the siege that he placed on not just Arafat, but that he placed on Gaza, that God placed him under a siege. For 8 years, he was in a coma and then he died. According to Islamic interpretation and understanding of how he lived his life and how many people he harmed and killed, where's Ariel Sharon now? So the veil is lifted and he could see that he has no power to disobey or to reject or to disbelieve. Now it's over. The testing period is over. He's in hellfire. So he's facing the day of judgment. So I, again, want to end it with how I began. Are those people who are not following the right path in spite of admonition and instruction, waiting for God, Allah, to come to them in canopies of clouds with a retinue of angels and settle the matter finally? To Allah shall all matters ultimately be referred. We could see that Yasser Arafat went back to God. He was poisoned. Ariel Sharon faced a coma for a number of years, and he went back to God. And all matters are now in God's hand. And there is nothing that me as a Palestinian or any Israeli can do to tell God or compel God or to tell God how to judge both individuals, given how they live their lives on it. So I don't think this video is going to impact those who are criminals. Once they reach that stage where they feel, they interpret that space to reject, that space to disobey, that space to commit crimes and no one can stop us. Once they reach that point, it's a sign that their hearts are sealed and no one can stop them. And that God is just using that to expose them, what's in their mind, what's in their heart. You know, he's removing the social reprimand. So everything now has become clear, what they are thinking, what they're feeling, what they want, what they desire, how they see the region, how they see people. You know, enough of the false love of we want peace, and we want two states. You know, all of that kind of went out the window. All of this is just exposing the individuals involved, what their intentions were, what their agenda were, and what the plans were for the region. But again, at a particular point in time, all matters will be ultimately referred. So Ismail Haniyeh went back to God. God we belong, to God is our final return. And at an appointed time, Benjamin Netanyahu will go back to God. I hope that he exits similar to Ariel Sharon. I don't think he should be, like kind of a Baruch Goldstein. They made him out to be a martyr, even though he was a criminal. It would be best that he dies and he exits this world, similar to Pharaoh. The way, what's his name, Raphael, I think, Eaton also like exited this world, where a big wave came and took him. I think this would be a good way for him to exit, where he huffs and puffs and thinks no one can stop me, and look, the international community can't do anything. And then he exits and he faces God, and it's, here's hell, enter it. So it's hard. I know a lot of people were like upset because they're seeing not just Ismail Haniyeh being killed, but they're also heard several individuals and Gaza killed like some journalists and others were working tirelessly to help people in Gaza. And you were hoping like a ceasefire would come, and now the negotiator is killed and more journalists are killed, and you're seeing others. You're worried about their lives being in danger because they're also journalists too. You monitor them. And you just have to keep, again, consoling yourself and recognizing that that space that is giving to them, you know, is just a test of the man's power of judgment and his moral stamina. And people are all now hearing and listening to them and their confessions on, you know, without us, like, no one's doing Kate on our end. We're not telling like Israelis say this, do this. You know, we're not manipulating the situation. We're just all bearing witness to what Israeli society actually thinks and believes. And it's not just Israeli society, like I tweeted in my Twitter. Sam Hussein, you mentioned, this is organized by European nations. So I like this ruling. These UN member states, you know, Israel would not be doing what it's doing if those UN member states, not just the US, but Canada, you know, Germany, UK, and others, if they were not all participating. Let's just say the United States is just the only sole person or nation that is funding and defending Israel. Well, you got the UK, Germany, Canada, Australia, you know, all those other, again, enlightened Western nations. They could all come together and say, hey, US, we need this to stop now. So it's not just that the US is not telling them to stop. They all are together, are colluding with each other. And they have a colonial agenda to destabilize the region along, you might say, colonial states and Israeli interests. So it's pretty obvious that this is what is taking place. And the response of killing the mediator is simply, again, I see it as a response to this ruling, as to say, like, anytime, again, the United Nations or ICJ, as I mentioned, they come up with a ruling about calling Israel to reason, calling their Israeli supporters to reason, they turn around and they come up with a new, again, hot potato and a kind of try and stop me type mentality and try to criminalize something and someone, you know, you UNRWA, Ismail Haniyeh, you know, they keep looking for something to push you away from that discussion to this discussion. And again, there is an appointed time when Netanyahu will be called back by God and he will exit. My hope is that he exits again, like Raphael Eaton or like Ariel Sharon. That kind of a death of a coward, you know, a death of someone who was so deluded with his power. And then everyone observes them not able to save themselves or not able to even speak, you know, like huffing and puffing, and then Ariel Sharon is in a coma for 8 years. Kind of that arrogance, pushing them to a position of where they can't move or speak at all. But I can only pray, and how God judges and deals with matters, you know, he's the most wise and all-knowing. So I thank you for listening. I hope this was beneficial to reflect on the situation and maybe to console oneself as we're seeing all of these deaths. Doesn't mean like we just ignore and keep going, but how we interpret the situation with the correct lens. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah wa barakatuh.